The mountains of Blue Ridge, North Carolina do not forgive mistakes. 4 people walk down a trail in silence. Behind them, a woman lies on the ice with a broken ankle. No phone, no keys, no pack. The temperature is dropping. The storm is 20 minutes out, and not one of them looks back. This is not a story about what they did to her. This is a story about what she did next. 3 years. 1 holding company. 72%. The morning she walked into that conference room, they were waiting for a stranger. They were waiting for a stranger. They had no idea the stranger was the woman they left on the mountain. She sat down at the head of the table that used to be her father's, the table they thought they had taken from her forever. She opened her folder, and the room went very, very still. The morning, Vanessa with kindness. That Vanessa Carter walked away from a 6-figure offer in Charlotte. Her mother called it stubbornness. Her brother called it something worse. Her father, Anthony Wilson, didn't call it anything. He just handed her a cup of coffee the next morning, set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and went back to reading his invoices. Paper invoices. In a manila binder with a rubber band around it. The kind of binder that belonged in 1987. Which was, now that Vanessa thought about it, exactly when her father had last updated his filing system. She didn't say that out loud, not on day 1. She was 36 years old, holding an MBA and 2 job offers that would have made her graduate advisor genuinely proud. Standing in the kitchen of the house she grew up in, watching her father read handwritten numbers with the focused calm of a man who had never once considered that there might be a faster way. She had driven 4 hours from Atlanta with 2 suitcases, and a decision that felt completely rational at 2 in the morning and slightly terrifying in daylight. Would you treat them with kindness? Because was the thing about Wilson Mountain Equipment that nobody in the business world would understand from the outside. The company was healthy. Revenue was solid. Customers came back. The reputation Anthony Wilson had spent 3 decades building in Piedmont, North Carolina, was the kind that didn't need advertising because it traveled through word of mouth the way good news in a small town always does. Quietly, through phone calls, between people who trusted each other. By any reasonable metric, the company was fine. Except it wasn't. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa had spent 6 weeks before making her decision running numbers in her apartment in Atlanta, cross-referencing what she knew about her father's operation against industry benchmarks. And what she found was a picture that looked healthy from the front and precarious from behind. Anthony Wilson knew every customer by name. He handled every major contract personally, sometimes driving 3 hours round trip to shake a hand before signing anything because he believed that kind of gesture mattered, and he wasn't wrong. He had built the whole enterprise around his own judgment, his own relationships, his own presence, and it worked. It genuinely worked. Right up until the moment you asked one quiet question. What happens if he's not here? The answer was nothing good. Not because the employees weren't capable, not because the customers weren't loyal, but because loyalty with kindness, but because loyalty and capability both need a structure to hold them together when the person at the center of everything is suddenly gone. And Wilson Mountain Equipment didn't have that structure. It had Anthony. And Anthony was 62 years old with a blood pressure issue his doctor had been mentioning for 3 years, and a habit of working through weekends that hadn't slowed down since 1991. Vanessa knew this the way you know things about people you grew up watching. Not from data alone, from the combination of data and the specific memory of her father at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, glasses pushed up on his forehead, squinting at a handwritten column of numbers with the patience of someone who had never learned to stop. So she came home, and she didn't announce it as a rescue mission, because Anthony Wilson was not the kind of man who accepted being rescued. She announced it as a business decision, which it was, and she sat across from him that first week and told him she wanted to learn the operation from the inside before she started making any suggestions. He looked at her over the top of his coffee cup, with an expression that was equal parts skepticism, and something she would only later understand was relief. And he said, "All right." 2 words. That was the whole conversation. She spent the first year not changing anything, just learning. Would you treat them with kindness? She followed Harold Reed through the warehouse on Tuesdays, watching how he moved through the space with the proprietary ease of a man who had been there since before she was born. The kind of ease that comes from knowing exactly where every tool is and exactly which vendor relationship required a particular kind of handling. She sat in on every supplier call. She read every contract, not just the summaries, the actual documents, every clause, every renewal term, every price adjustment provision that had been sitting dormant and unconsidered for years. Would you treat them with kindness? She watched Lorraine Mitchell run the monthly financial reviews with the smooth efficiency of someone who had developed a system for presenting numbers in a way that left you feeling informed without feeling like you'd actually seen everything. That last part took her a while to articulate. There was something in the way Lorraine moved through a financial presentation that Vanessa couldn't name precisely for a long time. Not dishonesty exactly, because there was nothing she could point to. Just a quality, a texture, like watching someone deal cards, and not being able to see which pocket the extra one came from, only knowing in the wordless way that comes from paying very close attention that something was slightly off. She filed that observation away and kept watching. Year 2, she started making small changes, not announcements, implementations. She built a client management system from scratch, migrating 23 years of Anthony's handwritten customer notes into a database that 3 different people could access and update. She standardized the service documentation process. She negotiated a revised rate with their primary steel supplier, the first renegotiation in over a decade, by simply pulling the market data and presenting it in a meeting with the kind of specificity that made arguing against it feel like arguing against arithmetic. The supplier had tried. They'd ended up taking 12% less than the previous rate. Anthony had been in the room for that negotiation, sitting to her left, and he hadn't said a word the whole time. Afterward, in the parking lot, he'd looked at her and said, "Where'd you learn to do that?" She'd said, "Emory," and he'd made a sound that might have been a laugh. The customers she started bringing in weren't Anthony's kind of customers. Would you treat them with kindness? They were larger, more systematic, the kind of companies that issued purchase orders through procurement portals and wanted quarterly performance reviews instead of a handshake at the beginning of the year. She courted them carefully because she understood that Anthony's existing relationships required a certain kind of preservation, a continuity of feel that his long-term clients would notice if it disappeared too suddenly. So she built the new revenue stream in parallel, like adding a second track alongside a functioning railroad without disrupting the trains already running. By year 4, the numbers told a story that was hard to argue with. Revenue was up significantly. The new enterprise accounts she'd brought in were generating contracts that dwarfed what any single legacy relationship had been worth individually. Would you treat them with kindness? The logistics division, which Harold Reed had been running with an iron grip and a deeply personal sense of territorial ownership, was processing 40% more volume than it had been 3 years earlier. Anthony treat them with kindness. Anthony's postgas boys. She still didn't say anything about it. Some things you leave alone. And then there were the things she didn't leave alone. Donald Thomas had been working at Wilson Mountain Equipment since he was 22 years old. He was 50 now, and he had the particular confidence of someone whose position in a room had never depended on performing well in it. He was good at certain things, genuinely good. Would you treat them with kindness? He could read a client's personality in the first 5 minutes of a meeting and calibrate his approach to match it with the kind of social precision that takes real talent. He was charming in the way that makes people feel seen, and he was smart enough to know which details to remember. What question to ask 6 months later that would make a client think he actually listened. That was real skill. Vanessa didn't underestimate it. What Donald couldn't do, and what he'd learned to obscure rather than address, was engage with financial complexity at the level the company's growing operation required. He could read a summary. Would you treat them with kindness? He could not look at a set of balance sheet, accounts and understand what the structure of the numbers was actually saying about the health of the business versus the appearance of it. That gap between understanding surface and understanding structure was the gap that mattered. And in the absence of real financial literacy, Donald had developed a different skill entirely. He'd become very good at aligning himself with whatever version of events made his position most secure. He had also spent 30 years assuming that the company would pass to him when Anthony was gone. Not because anyone had told him so explicitly. Because he was the oldest. Because he had been there the longest. Because, in his internal logic, which ran on the rails of a certain inherited expectation, the assumption didn't require justification. It simply was. Vanessa watched him recalibrate in real time as the company's numbers improved under her management. Would you treat them with kindness? She could see the arithmetic working in his head across quarterly meetings, the growing awareness that the growth wasn't something he could easily claim credit for, and wasn't something he could afford to dismiss. What she watched him land on, eventually, was a frame that his expression settled into like a mask that finally fit. Concern. He became very concerned about the direction of the company, concerned about pace, concerned about whether the new enterprise clients were the right fit for the company's culture, concerned, specifically, whenever Vanessa was in the room and a decision was being made. It wasn't something she could challenge directly, because concern is a position that doesn't require evidence. You can't argue someone out of being worried. You can only watch it and know what it is, and keep working. Lorraine Mitchell was a different calculation entirely. She was 47, and she had the kind of composure that people sometimes confuse with confidence because they look identical from the outside. Her presence them with kindness. Her presence in a room was precise. She dressed with the specificity of someone who understood that professional appearance is a form of information management, that the details you show people shape the questions they think to ask. Would you treat them with kindness? She had been running the company's finances for 11 years, and in that time had built a reporting structure that Anthony trusted completely and that Vanessa found increasingly difficult to read all the way through. Not because the reports were wrong. That was what made it hard. The numbers in the reports she was given access to were accurate in themselves. They just weren't complete. Would you treat them with kindness? There were structures within the financial architecture of the company, sub-accounts and expense categories and routing sequences, that Vanessa could see the edges of, but not the interior. Every time she pressed for more detail on a specific line item or expense cluster, Lorraine would produce an explanation that was thorough and technically correct, and somehow still managed to leave Vanessa with the feeling of having been walked to the edge of a room and stopped before the door opened. She started keeping her own parallel records in year 3. Nothing dramatic. Just her own tracking of certain cost ratios and vendor payment volumes, and the natural variances between what she'd expect to see given what she knew about the operation's real costs versus what was appearing in the reports. Most of the variances were small, explainable, the kind of noise that exists in any real business. But there was one cluster of vendor relationships. Suppliers Harold vendor relationships. Suppliers Harold Reed managed directly, where the payment volumes were running consistently above what the market rates should have supported. Not by a lot. By enough that you'd only notice if you'd been watching for a long time and knew what you were comparing against. She noticed, as she kept watching. She didn't say anything yet. Harold Reed was 64 years old and had been with Anthony Wilson since 1989. He was Anthony's older brother by 8 years, which meant he had been in Vanessa's life since before she had Vanessa's life, since before she had language for what he was, and the weight of that familiarity was something she had to consciously separate from the professional assessment she was building. Because the professional assessment was not gentle, Harold knew the physical infrastructure of the company better than anyone alive. He knew which hauler you called for what kind of load, and at what time of year, which regional vendors could be trusted to deliver on short notice, and which ones needed a follow-up call 48 hours in advance, or the shipment arrived late every single time. That knowledge was real, and it was valuable, and it had kept the logistics side of the operation running with a competence that Vanessa genuinely respected. It was everything adjacent to that knowledge that was the problem. Harold moved through his professional domain with the ease of a man who had decided, somewhere in his 40s, that his tenure entitled him to certain arrangements. Not loudly. He was not the custom person who made demands or issued ultimatums. He was the kind of person who, over a period of years, arranged the environment around himself so that certain things were simply how they were. Would you treat them with kindness? And the people who might have questioned it had long ago stopped looking closely enough to see what was actually there. He had vendor relationships that had been in place so long they were treated as permanent features of the landscape. He had contracts with hauling companies that renewed automatically, without competitive review. He had supplier arrangements that nobody else touched, because Harold's ownership of that domain was so complete and so long-standing that suggesting a review would have felt, in the particular culture Anthony had built, like an act of personal aggression against a man who had given the company his whole career. Vanessa understood that dynamic perfectly. She had been raised inside it. And then there was Patricia. Patricia Johnson was 68 years old and had been married to Anthony Wilson for 41 years. She was not a business person in the professional sense, had not worked in the company in any operational capacity, but she had an authority that didn't require a title, because it was built from decades of being the person Anthony talked to last before making any major decision. That influence, which was real even when it was invisible, had shaped the company's direction in ways that nobody sat down and documented, because it mostly happened at kitchen tables and in conversations on Sunday evenings that nobody else was present for. After Anthony, that authority had formalized into a board seat, which was largely ceremonial, and which Patricia treated as the opposite of that. Would you treat them with kindness? She had the quality of someone whose sense of what should happen was so settled that it felt to people around her like gravity, a natural force, rather than a preference. Would you treat them with kindness? When Patricia believed something was the right course of action, she communicated it with the calm certainty of a person who has never experienced significant doubt, and the effect of that certainty on people who loved her and wanted her approval was considerable. Vanessa loved her mother. Would you treat them with kindness? She also understood, in the way that children who have spent a long time paying close attention understand things about their parents, that her mother's sense of family loyalty operated according to a logic that did not distinguish very carefully between protecting people and protecting the structures those people depended on. Patricia Wilson, when she said family protects family, was not describing a value. She was describing a mechanism, one that Vanessa was about to run directly into. Anthony's death was a Tuesday. The call came from Donald, who sounded, for the first and only time Vanessa could ever remember, genuinely not in control of his voice. Would you treat them with kindness? She was in the middle of a contract negotiation with a mining operations company, 3 hours from Piedmont, sitting across a conference table from 2 procurement directors who had finally gotten to the number she'd been steering toward for 40 minutes. She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and listened to her brother say the words that rearranged everything. She drove back. She sat with her mother in the hospital, and then later at the house, and she did not think about the company at all for 4 days. That was the right thing to do, and she did it without effort, because some things override professional calculation without even trying. The funeral was large. 300 people, which for a man who had never sought publicity or pursued recognition was a number that meant something. Would you treat them with kindness, who had been buying from Anthony Wilson for 25 years, and who drove 4 hours to be there, because that was what you did when someone who had treated you right died? Haulers and suppliers and contractors and a few competitors who came, because they respected what he'd built even when it cost them business. The warehouse staff, all of them, which Vanessa noticed because she'd half expected some of them not to come, which was a thing she'd thought and was immediately ashamed of, and which turned out to be wrong. Her father had no enemies. That was rare. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd understood it intellectually before the funeral and felt it in a different register standing in the church while 300 people occupied the same space in grief for the same man. Would you treat them with kindness? And stood at the edge of the gathering and watched Harold shake hands with vendors and Patricia receive condolences with the composed dignity of a woman who had decided that public grief was a private matter, and she watched Donald move through the crowd with the attentiveness of someone who understood that a room like this was also, quietly, a moment of transition. And she knew, in the wordless way that watching people closely for years eventually produces, that the dynamics she'd been observing in the company for 6 years had just accelerated. That something was now in motion that had been waiting for exactly this moment to begin. She was right about that. She just didn't know how right yet. The first 2 years after Anthony's death were the years Vanessa spent explaining to herself what she was seeing, in terms that gave it the most charitable possible interpretation. Donald stepping into operational leadership as though the position had always been his, not because treat them with kindness, anyone formally assigned it to him, but because he occupied it with enough conviction that nobody pushed back. The board seat, Anthony had held distributing its weight toward Patricia, whose presence in every major conversation now carried the implicit authority of someone whose approval was understood to matter more than any organizational chart. Harold continuing to run logistics the way he always had, which meant with complete autonomy and no meaningful oversight, because challenging that arrangement in the first months after Anthony's death would have felt indecent in a way that was difficult to argue against. And Lorraine, whose financial reports had always required 3 conversations to fully understand, now producing reports that required 4. Vanessa kept working. She kept the enterprise accounts she'd brought in. She kept the supplier relationships she'd built. She kept renegotiating and systematizing and doing the work that needed doing because the company was still a real business with real employees and real customers, and it required real management regardless of what was happening in the family dynamics above it. She told herself the discomfort she felt was grief wearing an unfamiliar shape. She told herself that Donald's decisions would improve as he grew into the role. She told herself that Lorraine had a different communication style that required more patience than she was giving it. She was wrong on all of it, and the specific quality of being wrong, in that way, the way where you resist the evidence because the alternative is understanding that people you grew up with have been doing something you cannot forgive, is that it makes you feel the clarity, when it finally comes, as something you should have arrived at sooner. Not as revelation, as failure. A failure of attention that you actually paid the whole time. It started with a client report. Would you treat them with kindness? A regional construction company that had been in conversation with Wilson Mountain Equipment about a major equipment supply contract had requested a detailed financial overview before finalizing. It was the kind of documentation Vanessa had prepared before. She pulled the relevant accounts, ran the standard reconciliation, and found a gap in the vendor payment records that didn't match what she knew about their operating costs. Small gap. The kind you'd attribute to billing timing without looking twice. She looked twice. She pulled the underlying documentation, cross-referenced payment towards records against her parallel tracking from the previous 18 months. Then she went back further, then further still. The pictures that assembled itself across 3 weeks of careful work, late evenings in her office after everyone else had left the building, was not something she could attribute to timing differences or billing cycles or any other innocent mechanical explanation. Wilson Mountain Equipment was carrying debt significantly larger than what appeared in any internal report she had been given access to. The discrepancy wasn't visible in the surface financials because it wasn't being tracked in the surface financials. Lorraine had routed certain payments through a sub-account structures that classified them as routine operational expenses, which meant they appeared in the operating cost lines of the reports without flagging as the debt service they actually were. The payments were real. They were just attributed to the wrong thing. She followed the payments to their destinations. Several of the largest, attached to vendor contracts that Harold managed, were flowing to companies that, when Vanessa traced their state registration documents, had organizational connections that ran directly back to Harold himself. The billing rates those companies charged Wilson Mountain Equipment were substantially above market. The gap between what they were charging and what comparable services actually cost in the regional market had added up over the period Vanessa was examining, to a number that made her sit back from her laptop and spend several minutes looking at the wall. She checked her math, checked it again. It was correct. Then she kept pulling. What she found when she looked at the company's current debt picture was worse than the vendor payments alone. Donald had been using the financial reports, the ones Lorraine had structured to obscure the true liability picture, to support a case for a new secured loan. The loan was substantial. The collateral was the main production facility in Piedmont, the same building Anthony Wilson had expanded twice over 30 years, and that represented the primary physical asset of the entire operation. The bank required the loan to clear underwriting before it would fund, and the underwriting was based on financial statements that Lorraine had prepared. The purpose of the loan, as best Vanessa could reconstruct from the documents she could access, was not expansion. It was bridge financing. Donald needed a capital injection large enough to man-going drain to mask the ongoing drain from the vendor arrangements Harold had been running for long enough to allow them to continue without triggering the kind of creditor attention that default on a smaller obligation would produce. The whole structure was built to buy time, and the time it would buy was roughly 2 years, which Vanessa understood with the cold arithmetic of someone who has spent too long looking at what she's looking at, was probably as long as they'd calculated they needed before the situation became someone else's problem. For the loan to close, the bank needed a signature from every major shareholder. Anthony had left Vanessa a meaningful equity stake in the company. It was in the will, straightforwardly. She hadn't thought much about it since the estate had been settled, because she'd been focused on the work. She hadn't been thinking about it as leverage, because she hadn't been thinking in those terms at all. She was thinking in those terms now. She requested the family meeting. She framed it as a financial planning discussion, which was accurate enough that nobody questioned the main chief. And she sat down in the conference room in Piedmont on a Thursday afternoon, with Donald at the head of the table, and Lorraine to his left, and Harold at the far end, and Patricia in the chair to Donald's right, the one you treat them with kindness, the one that was close enough to the center to carry authority without technically being in charge. And she listened to Donald present the loan as strategic opportunity. He was good at it. She had to acknowledge that even then. He framed it as modernization, as a response to market opportunity, as exactly the kind of move Anthony Wilson would have made if he'd had access to the capital. He used her father's name the way people use names they know will land, with the timing of someone who has been practicing the sentence, and she felt the pull of it even knowing exactly what it was. Lorraine's materials were clean. Would you treat them with kindness? The numbers in the presentation package looked like they came from a company that was managing a manageable challenge, not a company that was carrying concealed debt and hemorrhaging money through fraudulent vendor arrangements. She had done careful work. If Vanessa hadn't spent 3 weeks pulling threads she hadn't been meant to find, she would have looked at that presentation package and seen what it was designed to show. Harold said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? He sat at the end of the table with the stillness of someone who has learned that silence in a room being run by other people is the safest possible position. Would you treat them with kindness? And he watched Vanessa the way you watch something you've been quietly calculating about for longer than the current meeting. Patricia sat with her hands folded in front of her, and her attention on Vanessa with the specific quality of watching that means, I expect you to do the right thing here, and we both know what the right thing is. Vanessa let Donald finish. She waited through the silence that followed, the silence that was meant to feel like inevitability, like the decision had already been made by reasonable people, and what was left was just the formality of agreement. Then she said she wouldn't sign. Not yet. Not without an independent audit of the company's full financial position before any new debt was added to the structure. She said it as cleanly as she could. She didn't use the word fraud. She didn't describe what she'd found. She said only that, if the company was in the condition the presentation described, an independent audit would confirm it quickly, and the loan would proceed without complication. The room went very still. Donald said, She was trying to take control of something that had never been hers to control. He said it with the patient conviction of someone who has been rehearsing that sentence longer than the current conversation. His voice stayed level. He'd learned, somewhere in the past 2 years, to perform reasonableness, even when what was underneath it was something else entirely. Lorraine looked at her the way she always looked at her when she believed Vanessa was being deliberately obstructive. A composed expression, careful and tight, that managed to communicate deep disappointment without exposing any of the machinery producing it. Harold uncrossed his arms once and then crossed them again. Patricia said what she said when she needed the family to close ranks. She said family protects family. She said it with the tone of someone describing a law of nature, something that existed independently of anyone's choice to invoke it, something that predated the current situation and would outlast it, and Vanessa understood, listening understood. Fill that conference room with that particular certainty, that for Patricia this was not rhetoric. This was belief. Real, settled, constitutional belief in a principle that Patricia had never interrogated, because it had never, until this moment, required interrogation. Would you treat them with kindness? And for the first time in a room with all of them watching her, Vanessa said the sentence she had been turning over in her mind for 3 weeks without letting herself say it. Protecting family does not mean helping your family steal. The silence after that was different from the silence before. Not the silence of inevitability. The silence of something that has been named and can no longer be unnamed. A thing that changes the air in a room so completely that everyone in it understands, without discussion, that what was possible before the sentence was spoken is no longer possible now. Donald's expression moved through something she couldn't fully track. Lorraine's pen was at the table's surface, without Vanessa seeing it arrive there. The meeting ended. Nobody said it was over. It simply ended, the way certain conversations end, not with a conclusion, but with an exhaustion of what the room can hold. 2 weeks later, Patricia called and said she wanted the family to make the annual trip to Blue Ridge Mountains. She said it was what Anthony would have wanted. She said she wanted them to find their way back to each other before the first anniversary of his death. She talked about the overlook at Crestline Pass, where they had scattered Anthony's ashes, about the specific quality of silence up there that her husband had loved, the kind where the wind moved and you could hear nothing made by human hands. Vanessa sat on the phone in her apartment and held what she was feeling for long enough to examine it honestly. Would you treat them with kindness? She didn't want to go, that was true. But underneath the not wanting to go was something she was more reluctant to look directly at, which was that she still believed in some version of what the trip was supposed to be. Would you treat them with kindness? The version where a family that had built something together could find, in the place that mattered most to the person who had built it, a conversation that wasn't possible in a conference room. She still believed that was possible. Even then, which was, she would understand later, the thing about that kind of hope. It doesn't feel naive while you're inside it. It feels like the only reasonable thing. They drove up on a Friday morning. The cabin near Crestline Pass was the same structure Anthony had maintained for 20 years, practical and durable and not beautiful, which was the combination he'd applied to everything he built. The first evening was careful. They cooked, they ate, they talked in the register that people use when they have agreed, without discussing it, to set aside the subjects that actually matter. It felt almost like something, almost like the family Vanessa had been holding in her mind on the drive up. A Saturday morning, the pretense ended. Would you treat them with kindness? She knew it was ending when she saw Donald's pack on the kitchen table and noticed, without quite understanding why it landed with weight, that it was heavier than it should have been for the hike they were doing. The trail to the overlook was the same one they'd walked the year before, the same cold, the same thin air above the tree line. Would you treat them with kindness? The same view at the top that her father had loved because it was the view that required the most effort to reach and rewarded it with a specific silence he'd never been able to fully describe. She had walked it with him a dozen times since childhood. She knew every switchback. Donald stopped them on a section of exposed trail, maybe half a mile from the overlook. He took a folder from his pack with the measured calm of Someone who had planned the moment carefully, who understood that environment shapes what feels possible, and who had chosen this particular environment with that in mind. He held the folder out to her. He told her this was the last opportunity to handle the matter cleanly, before it became something none of them could control. He said it with the specific patience of someone who has already made a calculation about what happens if the answer is no. The folder was the loan documents, the same ones she hadn't signed 2 weeks ago. She looked at him, at the folder, at the overlook in the distance where her father's ashes were scattered. She said no. She said that when she returned to Piedmont, she was going to contact an independent auditor and a corporate attorney, and that whatever the audit found would determine what happened to the loan application and to her continued involvement with the company. She would treat them with kindness, knowing exactly what it meant, and knowing, even as she said it, that she still held a belief she shouldn't have been holding, which was that there were lines they wouldn't cross. That she knew these people, had sat at dinner tables with them, had built her professional life around a company that bore her family's indirect name and their direct legacy. You don't easily arrive at the understanding that people you have loved your whole life are capable of the thing that happens next. She moved to leave the trail. The rock was icy. Would you treat them with kindness? She hadn't registered how much the temperature had dropped in the last hour, the way it drops at altitude when the weather is turning, not in a gradual slide, but in sudden steps. Her left foot came down at the wrong angle on a section of frost-covered stone, and her ankle turned with a force that was immediate and unambiguous and dropped her to the ground before she fully processed what had happened. The pain was serious, the kind that doesn't leave room for uncertainty about its nature. She reached for a handhold in the rock to her left and looked toward Donald because he was closest, maybe 8 feet away, and his expression in that moment was the one she would carry the longest, because it was not the expression of someone deciding. It was the expression of someone who had already decided, for whom the decision was complete, and who was now simply performing the next step of it. He reached for her pack, not for her hand. Her pack. Would you treat them with kindness? He unclipped it from her shoulders with a deliberate, unhurried steadiness that was worse than roughness would have been, and set it to the side of the trail. Lorraine had been watching from 2 steps back, and she moved now toward the right side of Vanessa's jacket, the outer pocket where Vanessa had tucked her phone that morning. Lorraine had seen her do it, had apparently noted it. Her hand went to the pocket and extracted the phone, without making eye contact, without a word, with the focus of someone completing a task they had prepared for. Harold stepped forward from the far edge of the trail, where he'd been standing slightly apart and crouched, and picked up the keyring that had fallen from the pack when Donald set it down. He turned the keys over once in his hand and put them in his own pocket, and they turned. All 3 of them, in the loose coordination of people who have discussed this without discussing it, turned away from her and began walking back down the trail toward the cabin. She called after Donald. She used his name twice. He didn't slow. She called after Lorraine. Nothing. After Harold. Nothing. The sound of her own voice, kindness. The sound of her own voice on that trail was the loneliest thing she had ever heard, and she had heard it. She would calculate later, approximately 6 times, before she understood that calling wasn't going to change anything. Patricia had been standing behind her for the whole conversation. Vanessa had been aware of her mother's presence at the edge of her field of vision throughout the confrontation, a still point 10 feet up the trail. She turned to her now. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at her mother's face and she said the thing she needed to say, not with the strategic framing she'd used in the conference room 2 weeks ago, not with the careful construction of someone building a case, but plainly, because there was nothing left to build. Her ankle was badly injured. The temperature was dropping. There was weather coming in from the northwest. She could see it in the change in the sky over the past hour, the specific gray that meant something serious was forming. She asked her mother to call for help. She asked her to wait. She told her she couldn't put weight on her left foot, and she had no phone, and there was weather coming, and she was asking her not to leave. Patricia stood still for a long time after that, long enough that Vanessa began, in some fractured and desperate part of her thinking, to believe that the stillness meant something. Would you treat them with kindness? That the stillness was her mother working through something and arriving somewhere that would produce a different result than the one that was clearly coming. What the stillness actually was, she would understand later, was her mother completing the internal work she had already mostly done. The decision had not been made in that moment. It had been assembled, quietly, over weeks, through the accumulation of smaller choices that individually each seemed manageable, and that collectively had arrived at this. Patricia looked at her daughter with an expression that Vanessa would spend a long time trying to describe to herself accurately. Not cruel, not cold. Something settled, the expression of someone who has done the difficult interior work, and for whom what remains is only the physical fact of moving. If you come back, you will destroy this family. Then she turned and followed the others down the mountain. Vanessa watched her mother's back until the trail bent and took her out of sight. She sat on the ground in the cold, with her left ankle sending pain signals that her nervous system was doing its best to process, and she waited. For a moment that was probably 10 seconds, and felt like considerably longer, for some alternative explanation to present itself. None did. Because the thing about understanding what is actually happening, when you have been resisting that understanding for a long time in favor of more comfortable interpretations, is that it arrives not as a shock, but as a settling, a quiet, terrible settling, as though the room, that has been slightly out of focus for years, has simply sharpened, and you see that the furniture was never in the positions you thought it was. They had not been making a point. They had not been staging a demonstration of how isolated she was. How dependent on their cooperation, how much easier compliance would have been. Would you treat them with kindness? They had stood on that trail and performed a calculation about outcomes and decided that the cold and the distance from the nearest road and the weather coming in from the northwest would solve the problem she had become. They had decided that outcome was acceptable. And then they had walked away. She registered the temperature dropping in a new way. Not the slow background cool of a mountain morning. The dropping that means something real is coming. Each degree of cold arriving faster than the one before. She moved. That was the only thing left to do. She moved. The compass was still in her jacket pocket. That was the first thing she understood when she stopped moving long enough to take inventory of what she had and what she didn't. No pack, no phone, no keys. Left ankle sending information she didn't want but couldn't ignore. Temperature dropping in the specific way that altitude drops temperature when the weather is serious. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of warning, but in sudden steps, each one arriving before you've fully processed the last. The jacket itself was the good one, the insulated one she'd grabbed that morning almost without thinking, which meant whoever had calculated the details of this afternoon hadn't factored in the jacket. Small, but something. She had to treat them with kindness, because Anthony Wilson had given it to her 14 months before he died. On the last hike they'd taken together up a shorter trail than Crestline, one of the Blue Ridge approaches on the eastern side that he'd been walking since his 40s. He'd produced it from his shirt pocket at the overlook, not as a gift exactly, more as a transfer of something he'd decided she was ready to carry. Brass casing, the edges worn smooth from decades of handling. The needle still perfectly calibrated, because he had never owned anything he wasn't willing to maintain. When the compass drifts, he'd told her, it's because someone stopped paying attention to it. He'd shown her how to orient the bezel. He'd told her the only thing the instrument was designed to do was tell the truth about direction regardless of how disoriented you felt. That it had no opinion about your circumstances, only about north, and from north you could work everything else out. She'd kept it in the inner left pocket of every jacket she owned since then, the way you keep something that represents a question you haven't finished answering. She oriented herself now. South, east. That was where the forestry maintenance station was. She knew it existed because she and Anthony had come across it on a longer route 6 years earlier. A structure that had been decommissioned but not demolished, which in the language of federal land management meant walls and a roof and probably not much else. Maybe 2 miles as a straight line through terrain that was not going to allow straight lines. She could not put full weight on her left ankle. What she could do was distribute pressure carefully, lean into the right side, move deliberately, and not stop. Not stop. That was the rule with kindness? That was the rule she gave herself because the alternative wasn't something she was willing to fully think through. She'd read enough about hypothermia to know that the seductive part of it, the part that made it dangerous, was how comfortable it felt in the late stages. The cold didn't hurt after a certain point. That was the trap. She was going to stay in the part where it hurt. She moved off the exposed trail and down into the cover of the terrain below the pass. The grade here was uneven, root systems and frozen ground, and sections where the snow was packed hard, and sections where it wasn't, and you treat them with kindness. And she had to test each step with a care that made the pace feel almost absurd against the dropping temperature and the sky that was turning the specific gray she'd learned to read from years of watching mountain weather with her father. That gray meant hours, not a day. She had hours. The first fall came 20 minutes in, not a bad one. She went down on her right knee, and both palms, and was back up before the cold in the snow penetrated the fabric of her gloves, which were, thankfully, still on her hands because they'd been in the jacket pockets when they'd taken the pack. She registered the fall, registered that her ankle had taken a second impact that it was loudly unhappy about, and kept moving. There was no alternative that she was willing to entertain. The second fall was harder. Would you treat them with kindness? She went sideways into a section of root and snow, and the ankle turned again in a way that produced a sound she felt rather than heard, and she lay still for a moment that was longer than it should have been, looking up at the gray sky through the bare upper branches of the trees, and she thought about her father, not as a source of comfort exactly, as a standard. Anthony Wilson had never once complained about a difficult situation in any terms that suggested the difficulty was unexpected or unfair. He had simply looked at what was in front of him and figured out the next step. He had applied that method to every problem she'd ever watched him face. She was going to apply it now. Next step. Literally. Get up. She got up. Would you treat them with kindness? The forestry station appeared at the edge of her flashlight range, and she had the flashlight because it was the one she kept clipped to the interior strap of the jacket. There since a camping trip 2 summers ago. 3/4 battery. Enough. The structure was small. Single room. The door was warped in its frame and the hinge on the left side was corroded, but the door opened. Inside, bare concrete floor. A shelf unit along the right wall with the ghost shapes of equipment long removed. And in the far corner, a metal storage locker that was not locked. Inside the locker, she found what she found. 2 emergency blankets still in their packaging, a box of waterproof matches that proved itself waterproof when she tested it, a first aid kit that was 15 years old by the label, but contained an elastic bandage wrap that was still usable, and a hand pump camping lantern with a fuel cell that was mostly empty, but produced a low, steady light when she worked the pump long enough. She wrapped the ankle. Would you treat them with kindness? She knew it needed more than wrapping, but wrapping was what she had, and she did it with the methodical attention of someone completing a necessary task, rather than someone managing a crisis. Because to treat them with kindness, because the distinction mattered and she was not going to let herself collapse into the second category. She layered both emergency blankets around her shoulders over the jacket. She sat against the wall farthest from the door, where a small amount of warmth had collected from the lantern, and she waited. The storm was bad. She could hear it in the way the structure itself responded, the low pressure of the wind, finding the gaps in the roof and the door frame. She could tell, from the sound and from what she'd observed about the sky before she got inside, that she had made it to cover with somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour to spare. She didn't let herself calculate what the alternative would have looked like. Instead, she thought, not about the family, not yet. She thought about the company, the real structure of it, the bones beneath the management that had been draining it. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about what the company actually was without the people currently running it, which was something with kindness, which was something valuable that was being treated as a mechanism for extraction, rather than a business worth sustaining. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about the technical team Anthony had assembled, people who knew the equipment, knew the clients, knew the regional geography of the work in ways that didn't live in any spreadsheet. She thought about the vendor network, the relationships with haulers and manufacturers and specialty parts suppliers that existed because Anthony Wilson had maintained them personally for decades, and that had structural durability, real durability, the kind that persists because it's built into contracts and geography and habit. The company was damaged, not broken. Those were different things. And somewhere in the second hour, in that station, would you treat them with kindness, with the storm pressing against the outside of the walls and the lantern burning low and her ankle wrapped and throbbing and her body, using whatever metabolic reserves she had left to maintain a core temperature that was clearly losing the argument? A thought came to her that was clean and without drama, and felt, in the way that the most important decisions sometimes feel, completely obvious in retrospect. She didn't want to go back to reclaim her position. She wanted to own it, not restore it, not recover it, acquire it fully, properly, on terms that would make what had happened on that trail, and in that conference room, and over the preceding 2 years of watching the company she'd built be slowly dismantled, something she had converted into a transaction rather than a wound. She held that thought through the rest of the first night. By the time the geological survey team's lights swept through the gap in the door, on the morning of the second day, she had worked out more of the structure of it than anyone in that team would have guessed from looking at her. The lead surveyor's name was Terry. He was maybe 30, wearing the orange vest of the U.S. Geological Survey crew, working the Blue Ridge that season. Would you treat them with kindness? And he came through the door first and stopped and looked at her and said something that she would not remember afterward, but that had the quality of professional surprise, brought under quick control. She told him she needed medical assistance and that he spoke kindness and that she was going to be fine and that she needed to borrow someone's phone. He gave her his without asking why. She called a number she had memorized 3 years earlier for reasons she hadn't fully understood at the time. Victor Bryant, her corporate attorney since Iron Leaf's theoretical early planning stages, which was to say since before Iron Leaf existed, and when she had been thinking carefully about what kind of legal structure she might eventually need. Victor answered on the second ring. She told him she was coming out of the Blue Ridge in a medical situation, and that she needed him to find a hotel room in a town she hadn't been to before, and to hold off on returning her next message until she called him from a stable location. He asked 2 clarifying questions. She answered them. He said he'd have a room ready in 2 hours. That was the whole call. The ambulance took 45 minutes to reach the access road closest to the station. The paramedics were good. They assessed the ankle, assessed her core temperature, started rewarming protocols in the back of the rig, and spoke to each other in the efficient shorthand of people who do this regularly. She answered their questions accurately and completely. She did not answer the questions they weren't asking. The hospital in Asheville kept her for 4 days. The ankle required surgery. A clean procedure, according to the orthopedic surgeon, which was his way of saying the outcome was good and the recovery would be full given time. Her core treat them with kindness. Her core temperature on arrival had been low enough to generate the kind of clinical concern that produces a certain quality of watchfulness in the nursing staff, a monitoring intensity that she understood and did not resist. She slept when her body required it and was awake and thinking the rest of the time. The police came on day 2. Would you treat them with kindness? A deputy and a detective who introduced themselves with the professional courtesy of people who have been sent to gather information from a patient in a hospital bed and who understand they may or may not get it in the form they're hoping for. She told them what had happened. All of it. The trail, the documents, the pack, the phone, the keys, the ankle, her mother's words, the 4 figures walking down the mountain while she lay on the icy trail calling after them. She said it clearly and in sequence and with the kind of detail that comes from having nothing to manage or hide. The detective wrote everything down. The deputy's expression moved through several stages that were professionally suppressed, but not entirely successfully. When she finished, the detective told her they'd spoken to the family. Donald had stated that she had become agitated during the hike following a family disagreement and had walked off the trail on her own. He'd said they'd looked for her briefly, hadn't been able to locate her, and had assumed she'd found her way down and left separately. He'd provided the same account from Lorraine, from Harold, and from Patricia, which the detective communicated with the particular careful neutrality of someone describing a problem they cannot currently solve. 4 accounts against 1. No cameras on that trail. No independent witnesses. The physical evidence of her injuries was consistent with exposure and a fall, but not specifically inconsistent with the version Donald had given. The detective told her the matter would be reviewed. He didn't say what he expected the outcome of that review to be. He didn't need to. She understood something clearly in that hospital bed that she had been building toward for a long time, but had not yet fully articulated to herself. The legal path, the path of testimony and official process, and asking an institution to arbitrate what had happened on that trail, was not going to produce what she needed. Not because the truth was unavailable. Because the truth, in the form she could currently present it, was precisely as powerful as 4 coordinated accounts would allow it to be, which was not powerful enough. The system was working exactly as designed. She needed a different tool. She left the hospital on day 4, against the recommendation of the nursing staff, but not against medical orders, which was the distinction she had spent a day establishing. She discharged herself, put on the clothes a friend had brought from her apartment in Charlotte, and was driven to a rental car by a man named Kevin Moore, who had been her college roommate's husband for 12 years, and who drove 3 hours to the hospital without being asked for anything beyond the address. She thanked him in the parking lot. He said something she didn't fully hear and squeezed her shoulder once and drove away. Would you west out of kindness? She drove a town she'd never been to, a small city on the edge of the Tennessee border in the North Carolina mountains, and checked into the kind of hotel that had a desk with real wooden drawers and a coffee maker that worked and a window that faced the parking lot rather than anything scenic, which was exactly what she wanted. She sat on the bed in that room for a long time. She thought about the attorney option, the audit option, the confrontation option. She turned each one over and examined what it produced at the end. All 3 led back to the same place, which was a disputed accounting of events in a family that had demonstrated specifically and without ambiguity what they were willing to do to protect what they held. Would you treat them with kindness? Going back to fight for her position inside that structure, she understood, would be going back to a fight that had already been set up for her to lose. She was not interested in fighting for her position. She was interested in acquiring the asset. She found a legal pad in the desk drawer. She started writing. She wrote for 6 hours by hand. Would you treat them with kindness? Everything she could reconstruct from memory about the financial architecture of Wilson Mountain Equipment, every sub-account structure she'd mapped, every vendor payment routing she'd traced, every rate she'd benchmarked against market data. Would you treat them with kindness? She wrote names and dates and amounts, and the logical connections between them with the care of someone building a document that might someday need to withstand professional scrutiny. When she was done, she read through it twice, made corrections and set it on the desk, and looked at it for a while. Then she called Victor Bryant. Victor was 63, had been doing corporate and M&A law for 38 years, and had the quality that she had come to value in him above all others, which was that he never treated any information she gave him as the occasion for an emotional response. He took it in, processed it, asked the questions that were actually relevant, and produced analysis. She told him everything. The whole structure, the vendor arrangements, the sub-accounts, the loan plan, what had happened on the trail, the hospital, the police conversation, and the conclusion she had arrived at sitting on the bed in a hotel room at the edge of Tennessee. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not going back to sue them." She said that was correct. "You want to buy the company." She said that was also correct. Another silence, shorter. "I need 48 hours to run some preliminary research." "Where are you going?" She told him Portland, Oregon. Would you treat them with kindness? She had a friend from graduate school who had offered a spare room, and she was going to take it, because she needed to be somewhere she had no history and where nobody would think to look for her while she built what she was building. Victor said he'd call her in 2 days. He said one other thing before he hung up. The fact that they thought this would stop you tells me more about their judgment than about your situation. She didn't respond to that, not because it didn't land, but because she was already thinking about the next thing. Portland in November was cold in the Pacific Northwest way, which is different from the mountain cold she'd just survived. Softer and damper and persistent in a way that gets into your bones without ever announcing itself dramatically. Would you treat them with kindness? She slept for 2 days in the spare room of Diane Coleman's apartment, and when she woke up the second time, she felt something that wasn't quite normal, but was close enough to functional to work with. Darnell Cooper was the first call she made from Portland, and she made it before she called anyone in her professional network, or her financial contacts, or anyone who could be described as a resource. Because Darnell wasn't a resource. He was a person who had worked alongside her for 4 years. In the logistics analysis function she'd built at Wilson Mountain Equipment, who had the particular quality of mind that sees structural problems in supply chains before they generate symptoms. Would you treat them with kindness? And who had watched what was happening to the company from a vantage point that was close enough to be informed and far enough from the family to be clear-eyed. She'd been thinking about him for most of the drive from Asheville. She called him and said, "I left Wilson Mountain Equipment. I'm not going back in the same capacity. I'm building something else. I need your analytical capabilities, and I can't offer you what you're making now. Not yet. But I believe what I'm building will be worth the risk. If you're not interested, I understand." He said, "When do you need me in Portland?" She said, 2 weeks. He said, "Okay." And that was it. Iron Leaf Procurement Group began in the second bedroom of Diane's apartment, which Diane converted into a workspace with the practical generosity of someone who understood that her friend needed a room with a desk more than she needed a place to store her off-season clothes. Vanessa set up the table, the laptop, the legal pad she'd brought from North Carolina, and a whiteboard she bought from an office supply store 3 blocks away. Darnell flew in on a Tuesday and was at the table with his own laptop by Wednesday morning. Would you treat them with kindness? The name came from a conversation they had on the 3rd day, when they were trying to work out what the company's identity should be, what its positioning in the procurement consulting space should communicate. She'd been turning it over for a while, something about endurance, something about the work being structural rather than cosmetic. Iron for what holds, leaf for what grows from what holds. She said it half-testing, and Darnell looked up from his laptop and said, "That's it," and they moved on. The first client came 6 weeks in. Would you treat them with kindness? A regional food distribution company in the Willamette Valley that had been running the same supplier contracts for 8 years without review, and was watching its margins compress in ways its leadership couldn't fully account for. Vanessa walked in, looked at the numbers for 2 hours, and identified $17,000 in annual savings available through renegotiation of 3 existing contracts, without losing any incumbent suppliers. She laid it out in a presentation that lasted 40 minutes and was not interrupted once. The company's operations director, a woman named Sandra who had been in procurement for 22 years, and had a reliable instinct for consultants who were selling something versus consultants who understood something, signed the engagement agreement the next morning. Sandra's results generated a referral that generated another referral that generated a client engagement that was 3 times the size of the first. By month 6, Iron Leaf had 4 active clients, and Darnell was working 16-hour days that he refused to describe as a problem because they were productive hours, which was, he maintained, the only kind worth counting. The 3rd desk arrived in month 8. They could finally justify it. The person who sat in it was a supply chain analyst named Kathleen Robinson, who had been working for a logistics firm in Seattle, who had interviewed with 2 larger consultancies first, and who had chosen Iron Leaf because, as she put it in the conversation afterward, the problems here are real, and the answers haven't been decided in advance. Vanessa understood exactly what she meant. Month 7 was the month that nearly ended everything. Not through catastrophe, through the quiet arithmetic of a business that was building real capability too slowly to cover its costs in the short term. Would you treat them with kindness? A regional construction materials company they'd been in deep negotiation with for 3 months. The engagement that would have tripled their monthly revenue and given them the kind of contract they could anchor everything else around, withdrew at the final stage. The new procurement director wanted a firm with a minimum of 15 staff. Iron Leaf had 2, about to be 3. The decision wasn't personal. It was policy. The decision was also devastating in a way that Vanessa spent one evening acknowledging and then refused to return to. She paid Darnell first. That was not a decision she made consciously. Would you treat them with kindness? It was not the product of calculation. It was simply the first thing she did when she sat down with the accounts that week. Pay Darnell. And then she looked at what was left and understood that she had approximately 6 weeks before the math stopped working. She sat in her car in the parking lot of their office building for an hour, not because she didn't know what to do, because she needed to do it without the residue of panic. And that required sitting with the panic until it settled. She thought about the call she could make to North Carolina, the accommodation she could reach, the version of herself that went back and signed the document and took the lesser position in exchange for stability. She thought about that version of herself with the care she'd learned to apply to any option she was seriously considering. Then she dismissed it entirely. She had a contact, not a close one, a woman named Amy Walker, who had been the procurement director at a construction company Vanessa had crossed paths with at an industry conference in Seattle 8 months earlier. Amy had moved to a materials distribution company in Salem. Vanessa called her and made a specific, brief, honest case for a limited scope engagement, not the full restructuring project she'd been pitching to the larger clients, but a targeted 6-week analysis of 2 specific supplier relationships that Amy's company had been having trouble with. Amy listened. She said she'd run it by her VP. She called back in 48 hours and said yes. The Salem engagement was modest. The results were specific and measurable and documented precisely. Amy sent the documentation to 3 contacts in her network with a note that said the analysis had found what the firm's internal team hadn't found in 2 years of looking. One of those contacts became Iron Leaf's next client. That client's CFO mentioned them to a colleague in the agricultural equipment distribution sector. And that conversation became the engagement that finally, in month 14, gave them the scale they'd been working toward. Real reputation in the procurement space is one of the slowest things to build and one of the hardest to fake. A contract either produces the savings it was supposed to produce or it doesn't. A renegotiated supplier agreement either holds under the first test of friction or it collapses, and when it collapses, the client remembers. There is no version of that work where confident presentation substitutes for actual competence, which was why Vanessa had always been comfortable in it, and why she'd been willing to build it from nothing in a city where her name meant nothing, and her track record was housed in a company she could reference, but whose internal workings she couldn't fully discuss. By the end of year 2, Iron Leaf had moved into a proper office in Portland's Pearl District, a real space with 6 people and 3 conference rooms, and a kitchen that Darnell had stocked with the specific thoughtfulness of someone who understood that good food in a difficult week was a form of operational support. Would you treat them with kindness? The enterprise contract they'd closed in the second quarter of that year, a regional construction company's full materials, sourcing restructure ahead of a $40 million expansion, was the kind of work Vanessa had spent 6 years at Wilson Mountain Equipment preparing to do. She did it in 11 weeks. The results were better than projected by a margin that her client's CFO called not what we expected from a firm your size in a tone that meant it as a compliment, which she accepted as exactly that. She did not spend those 2 years thinking about Wilson Mountain Equipment with any regularity. That was not entirely honest, and she knew it. Would you treat them with kindness? There were evenings when the company came back to her in the form of a specific memory or a number she'd tracked that connected to something she'd seen in Lorraine's reports, Would you treat them with kindness? And those evenings required a particular kind of discipline to move through without being pulled back into the emotional register that the company still occupied somewhere in her. She had made a deliberate choice not to monitor what was happening there. She'd walked away from that situation for a reason. Revisiting it, even passively, was a form of refusing to leave. So she left, or she tried to, and she focused on what was in front of her. Victor Bryant called on a Wednesday afternoon 2 years and 4 months after she'd driven out of North Carolina. He asked if she had 30 minutes. She said yes, and he came to the office with a folder and set it on her desk without preamble, which was how he communicated that what he was about to say required her full attention rather than the half attention she sometimes gave to preliminary conversations. A regional commercial bank based in Charlotte, operating in the Piedmont and Western North Carolina market, was actively seeking buyers for a distressed debt position, a substantial secured loan that had entered technical default following 18 consecutive months of covenant violations by the borrowing company. The asset securing the loan was the primary production facility. The borrowing company was Wilson Mountain Equipment. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa looked at the folder for longer than she opened it. She was aware of what she was, and she was aware that what she was feeling was not a useful guide to what she should do, which was the lesson she had learned thoroughly in the 2 years since sitting on a hotel bed at the edge of Tennessee and deciding what kind of response she was actually interested in making. She kept the folder closed and asked Victor how he'd found it. Would you treat them with kindness? He told her the bank had approached a boutique investment advisory firm he had a relationship with, looking for qualified buyers who understood the industrial equipment sector. Would you treat them with kindness? Victor had flagged it because he knew her history, enough of it anyway, and because he'd run a preliminary assessment of the underlying business and believed there was genuine recoverable value beneath what current management had done to the balance sheet. She asked him for a week. He said he'd wait. Then she opened the folder. Would you treat them with kindness? The picture that assembled itself from the initial documentation and from the full audit Victor commissioned through a third-party firm 2 weeks later when she'd decided to proceed was exactly what she had expected in some ways, and more than she'd expected in others. Would you treat them with kindness? Donald had been borrowing at a pace that only made sense if you assumed the revenue growth Vanessa had built would continue indefinitely, which it had not, because the clients who had generated that growth had been leaving since the year she departed, not all at once. Steadily. The kind of attrition that happens when the person who built the relationship is gone, and the replacement relationship is maintained with less care than the original. Some of those with kindness. Some of those clients had tried to continue and found that the experience of working with Wilson Mountain Equipment under Donald's management was different enough from what they'd known under Vanessa that after 18 months they'd made different arrangements. The vendor fraud had kindness. The fraud had continued. Earl Reed had added a 4th company to the arrangement in the 2nd year after Vanessa left, which meant the drain had accelerated precisely when the revenue base was contracting. Would you treat them with kindness? The financial reports Lorraine was producing continued to present a picture that was technically accurate at the line level and structurally misleading in aggregate. Would you treat them with kindness? And she had apparently become skilled enough at the practice to have sustained it through 2 rounds of bank review without triggering concern. Would you treat them with kindness? Until the bank had started looking more carefully, until the covenants started breaking, and the bank had started asking questions that Lorraine's particular skill set was not sufficient to answer. The bone structure of the company, though, was the thing that changed her mind from possible to certain. Anthony Wilson had spent 30 years building a technical workforce that understood equipment at a depth that didn't come from training programs or certifications, but from proximity to the work and from the culture he'd created around doing things right. That workforce was still largely intact. They'd stayed not because the management was good, but because the work was honest and because many of them had been there long enough that the company itself, not any particular leader, was the thing they were loyal to. The regional supplier network had structural durability for the same reason. Those relationships existed in contracts and geography and long habit. They hadn't been sustained under Donald's management. would treat them with kindness? They'd simply persisted because they were the kind of thing that takes more active effort to destroy than to maintain. What she was looking at was a company whose problem was its leadership, not its market, not its workforce, not its asset base. That was a solvable problem. Specifically, it was her kind of problem. She told Victor to proceed. Would you treat them with kindness? The structure they built took 6 weeks to establish and was designed with the specific architecture of something that needed to close before the people on the other side of it understood who was closing it. Not deception, Victor was precise about this. Nothing that couldn't be defended in full daylight to any regulatory body with jurisdiction, but organized in a way that kept the identity of the ultimate beneficial owner from appearing in any routine search of the acquiring entity's ownership chain. A holding company, properly layered, with investors who were legitimate, and whose connections to Vanessa were real but indirect enough that following the chain required real investigative effort rather than a database search. She chose the investors carefully. People who understood procurement and industrial equipment and who had no emotional stake in the outcome except the financial one, which meant their commitment was clean and their discretion was professional rather than dependent on loyalty. The bank accepted the distressed debt purchase at a price below stated value because the alternative was a protracted default process with uncertain recovery timelines, and they'd already waited longer than they wanted to. She bought 2 minority equity positions from shareholders who had known Anthony and had watched with visible and documented frustration as the company's performance deteriorated. Both sold without significant negotiation. Both seemed, in the brief conversations that preceded the agreements, to understand something about who the buyer might be that the formal structure wasn't confirming. She didn't confirm it either. They didn't ask directly. Would you treat them with kindness? When the combined position was assembled, the holding company controlled enough of Wilson Mountain Equipment's debt and equity to determine the outcome of any restructuring process. Donald didn't know who the creditor was. He assumed, because people who have never built anything from a position of genuine uncertainty tend to assume this, that a corporate creditor is a distant institution with a financial motive and no personal investment in the specific history of the asset it's pursuing. He assumed the situation was manageable in the way he'd managed situations his whole career, through negotiation and relationship building, and the careful management of how things appeared. He was wrong, and there were signs of that wrongness visible in what he tried over the following 2 months. He contacted 3 private lenders about alternative capital. None moved forward after preliminary review. Lorraine adjusted several financial reports to soften the indicators that were generimos, which produced documents that were less defensible than the ones they replaced, while also being less useful to the bank's review process, which was not the intended effect. Harold, whose concerns had shifted from revenue extraction to self-preservation, with the focus of someone who understands that the tide has turned, began attempting to move vendor contracts and supplier agreements out of the main corporate entity and into subsidiary structures, a maneuver that, if completed, would have stripped meaningful, recoverable value from the asset before any ownership change could capture it. Victor flagged Harold's activity on a Tuesday afternoon with the particular calm of a man who had seen this pattern before and had the tools to address it. They challenged the transfers through the mechanisms available to a secured creditor, which were substantial, and the legal position the holding company occupied was strong enough that the challenges succeeded. Most of what Harold attempted to move stayed where it was. Would you treat them with kindness? She was working at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, the Portland office quiet except for her and the specific ambient sound of a building's mechanical systems, running through the hours when nobody's supposed to be there, when Victor called. Would you treat them with kindness? His voice carried the controlled quality it carried when he was managing something he didn't want to escalate before he had to. He told her that in the course of reviewing the holding company's ownership chain, a review Harold's attorney had initiated, looking for grounds to challenge the creditor's standing, a connection had surfaced. One of the early investors in the holding entity had a name that appeared in a different capacity in Wilson Mountain Equipment's vendor records. The connection was indirect, not dispositive. But if Harold's attorney was already looking, and if they found it before the transaction closed, they could use it to seek a delay. And a delay at this stage was the only thing Donald needed to find the alternative capital that had so far eluded him. Victor had identified the solution. He needed her authorizations to implement it quickly. She gave it, then she put the phone down and looked at the wall of her office for a moment before picking it up again. They worked through the night. Victor and his team, and Vanessa at her desk in Portland, connected by phone and screen share. The early investor in the holding entity agreed to transfer the position in trust to a different instrument with no visible connection to the Wilson records. The transfer was documented, properly structured, and filed before any search result from Harold's attorney could return the older version. By 6 a.m, the exposure had been closed. The ownership chain was clean in every direction. Vanessa had not slept, and was aware of that fact in the background of her thinking without finding it particularly relevant to what needed to happen in the next 3 hours. Victor was in his car by 7. He was on the road to Piedmont. She made coffee. She looked out the window at the Pearl District going gray and slow in the early morning. She thought about her father's compass, which was in the drawer of her desk in this office. Would you treat them with kindness? In the wooden box she'd kept since North Carolina, and she thought about what it meant that she had carried it out of those mountains in her jacket pocket on the night the survey team found her. Would you treat them with kindness? And that she had kept it ever since, the way you keep something that still has a purpose you haven't finished using it for. Would you treat them with kindness? At 9 o'clock that morning, in the conference room of Wilson Mountain Equipment in Piedmont, North Carolina, Donald Thomas and Lorraine Mitchell and Harold Reed and Patricia Johnson signed the restructuring agreement. The holding company, and through it, Iron Leaf Procurement Group and its principals, received 72% ownership in exchange for retiring the majority of the company's outstanding debt and providing the working capital necessary to stabilize operations. Donald objected. Repeatedly. At volume. Patricia told him, with the flat certainty she applied to every statement she believed to be simply true, that there was no other option. He signed. They all signed. When the last signature was complete, Donald looked across the table at Victor and asked when he would be able to meet the new owner. Victor gathered the executed documents, checked his watch, and said the new owner would be available tomorrow morning in this conference room at 9 o'clock. Donald nodded as though that made sense. As though it was a courtesy being extended to him rather than the last hour of something he had not understood was already over. Then Victor left, and the family sat with what they had agreed to, and none of them knew yet what was walking through the door in the morning. She drove into Piedmont at 8:15 in the morning, and the town looked the way towns look when you haven't seen them in 3 years, simultaneously smaller than memory and more loaded with it. The same water tower on the hill east of the commercial district. The same grain of the light at that hour, low and particular to this part of the North Carolina, Piedmont, in autumn. The kind of light that doesn't exist at the same angle anywhere else, and that she'd grown up taking for granted and had not once taken for granted since leaving. Would you treat them with kindness? She had driven from Charlotte, where she'd spent the night in a hotel she'd chosen specifically because she had no associations with it. And she had driven the 40 minutes from Charlotte to Piedmont with the compass on the passenger seat beside her, not because she needed it for navigation, but because it was the right object to have present for the drive. The hotel in Piedmont was a place she had never stayed in, despite having grown up here, which was exactly what she'd wanted. Neutral ground. She checked in, set the compass on the desk, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall, not from hesitation. From something closer to what athletes describe as the quiet before the start. Not the absence of readiness, but the presence of it, settled and waiting. She had spent 3 years building toward this morning. She had spent the previous 12 hours not thinking about it, which was a discipline she'd developed, and which had required, last night, watching 2 hours of television she couldn't have described to anyone afterward. She thought about Anthony. Not with grief exactly, because grief for her father had long since moved past the acute stage into something quieter. and more permanent, a background frequency she carried, rather than a condition she entered. She thought about him, the way she thought about him, when she needed to remember what she was actually doing this for, which wasn't the company in the abstract or the equity, position, or the legal architecture Victor had spent 6 weeks constructing. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the thing the company had been before the people currently running it had turned it into an instrument for their own protection. Would you treat them with kindness? The thing Anthony had built with 30 years of answering his phone at 10 o'clock at night and driving 3 hours to shake a hand before signing anything and refusing structurally, constitutionally, to let a transaction happen between him, and another person without that person feeling treated with respect. That thing still existed in the company's bones. She had seen it in the audit. She was going to put it back in the management. She looked at the compass on the desk. Would you treat them with kindness? The needle settled in its housing without drama, pointing the same direction it always had, indifferent to the fact that this particular morning was the morning she was going back. Her father had maintained with kindness. Her father had maintained it because maintenance was what you did for things you intended to keep using. She had maintained it for the same reason. Victor was waiting at the building's main entrance when she pulled into the lot at 8:43. Would you treat them with kindness? He was wearing the dark gray suit he wore when he needed to communicate something in a room without saying it aloud, which was his version of professional armor, and he was carrying them with kindness, and he was carrying his case with the ease of someone who had already completed the morning's internal preparation and was ready for whatever the next several hours produced. He looked at her across the lot as she walked toward him, and there was a moment of assessment in his expression that resolved into something that was not quite a nod, but served the same function. She had worked with him long enough to understand his economy of gesture. Would you treat them with kindness? The receptionist at the front desk was a woman named Monica, who had been working the front entrance of Wilson Mountain Equipment since Vanessa's second year managing the company's growth. A woman she knew by name and manner, and the specific way Monica organized the visitor log alphabetically, rather than chronologically, because she found it easier to cross-reference. Monica looked up from her desk with the automatic professional attention of someone performing the first 10 seconds of a standard greeting, and then she saw who had walked in behind Victor, and the greeting stopped at approximately the second syllable. Her expression moved through something genuine and complex, and then landed on a composed version of recognition that was doing visible work to hold itself together. Vanessa looked at her and said, simply, "Good morning, Monica," and kept walking. The hallway to the conference room was the same hallway she had walked several thousand times over the years she'd worked here. Same you treat them with kindness. Same industrial carpet with the pattern that had always looked like a mistake and had probably been a purchasing decision made by someone who no longer worked here. Same awards and certifications on the left wall, the ones Anthony had accepted with the mild embarrassment of a man who didn't trust recognition. Same fire extinguisher in the bracket on the right. Everything exactly as it was except the specific gravity of the walk, which was different in a way that had nothing to do with the hallway. Through the glass panel beside the conference room door, she could see them arranged around the table with the unconscious territorial logic of people who have been sitting in the same relative positions for years. Donald at the head, Lorraine to his left, Harold at the far end, arms crossed, eyes moving between the door and the middle distance with the focus of someone running calculations. Patricia to Donald's right, positioned in the way she had always positioned herself in any room that had an operational center, close enough to be consulted without being technically responsible for the outcome. There were 2 additional with kindness. There were 2 additional people at the table, senior managers she recognized, a man from the technical division named Brian, and a woman from client services named Teresa, and the bank's regional representative who had overseen the restructuring documentation, and a corporate attorney she didn't recognize, who must have been someone Donald had retained, recently probably, within the last 30 days once the shape of the situation had become clear enough to justify the expense. They were all talking, in the low, constrained register of people waiting for something they believe they can manage. She could hear the texture of it through the glass without making out the words. The particular still acoustic signature of a room in which everyone present believes the next hour is going to be difficult but navigable. She had sat in rooms with that acoustic signature many times. She understood what it meant, and she understood what was about to happen to it. Victor opened the door and walked in first. The conversation at the table stopped in the specific way that conversations stop when the person who enters the room is not the person expected. It was not a dramatic silence. It was the small functional pause of a room recalibrating, people looking up to evaluate the new information and returning to their prior state. Victor set his case on the table and reached for the chair to the left of the head position, and did not sit but stood, which communicated that he was waiting for someone else to occupy the primary position. Vanessa walked in. The silence that followed was not the functional kind. She had thought about this moment specifically during the drive from Charlotte, had thought about what it would look like to walk into a room of people who had last seen her on a mountain trail and had made a collective decision about her survival, and to do so in a condition that was the precise opposite of what that decision had calculated for. She had thought about it, and then she had decided, somewhere around the exit for Concord, that what she actually wanted was to not be performing any version of this moment when it arrived. To simply walk in and let the room be what it was and do what she'd come to do. So that was what she did. She walked to the head of the table. The recognition moved through the room in sequence, and she watched it without hurrying it. Donald's face went through something that had several stages, a compression followed by a rearrangement, a visible internal reorganization that ended in the stillness she recognized from their worst arguments, the stillness that preceded something he'd been preparing for longer than the current situation. Lorraine's pen contacted the table before she'd registered dropping it, a small, mechanical fact that her hand had committed to independently of whatever her expression was managing. Harold's face did what Harold's face always did when something went significantly wrong. It went deliberately blank, a professional blankness rather than an emotional one. The controlled absence of expression that means a person is computing rather than reacting. The bank's representative showed nothing because nothing in this development was new to him. The two senior managers, Brian and Teresa, exchanged a look that carried primarily confusion and secondarily something that required a moment to name, and that Vanessa eventually identified as relief, which was the most informative piece of information in the room. Patricia stood up. This was not something Patricia Johnson did for anyone or anything in a professional setting without full intentional choice. She stood up, and the fact that she had done it involuntarily, that her body had overridden whatever the managed version of this moment was supposed to look like, told Vanessa more about her mother's current state than anything Patricia would say in the next hour. Donald was still in the chair at the head of the table. He didn't move immediately. He was waiting for something. Would you treat them with kindness? Some internal signal about what the appropriate response was. And the signal was taking longer than the situation would comfortably accommodate. Vanessa stood at the end of the table and looked at him and waited too, with the particular patience of someone who knows exactly how this resolves and is content to let it take the time it takes. After a long moment, Donald pushed back from the chair and stood. She sat down. Would you treat them with kindness? Victor opened his case and arranged the documentation on the table with the organized efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this presentation, because the presentation mattered, and he was not a person who left things that mattered to improvisation, he explained. In the clear and sequential manner he applied to all legal communication regardless of the emotional charge in the room, that Iron Leaf Procurement Group and its associated holding entities had, through a series of legally executed transactions completed over the preceding months, acquired 72% ownership of Wilson Mountain Equipment through the purchase of the company's distressed debt position from the regional bank and the acquisition of outstanding equity from two minority shareholders. The beneficial owner of the controlling interest in the acquiring entity was Vanessa Carter. Effective immediately, she held operational authority over Wilson Mountain Equipment as its majority owner, superseding the existing management structure for all material decisions. the restructuring agreement executed the previous day, under which Donald and Lorraine and Harold and Patricia had signed, had formalized the ownership transfer and established the terms under which existing debt would be retired and working capital provided. Donald said, "This is fraud." He said it with the specific conviction of a man who has arrived at a characterization he finds genuinely satisfying, as though labeling the thing accurately was the same as reversing it. Vanessa said, "You signed the agreement yesterday. You had legal representation. The transaction is documented and transparent to every regulatory body with jurisdiction over it. If you want to contest the ownership structure in court, Victor will provide your attorney with the complete documentation. You planned this from the beginning. I planned this after you left me on a mountain." The room absorbed that, not dramatically, the way a room absorbs something true that has been said plainly. Donald's attorney, the ones she didn't know, made a note on the legal pad in front of him with the focused attention of someone who understands that the next several minutes will need to be reconstructed accurately later. Lorraine said nothing. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Her pen was still on the table where it had landed and she had not reached for it, which was notable because Lorraine Mitchell was not a person who left objects out of position without reason. She was looking at a fixed point on the surface of the table in front of her, with the concentration of someone doing intensive internal work, and, whatever that work was producing, it was not appearing on her face. Harold said nothing either. "Would you treat them with kindness?" His arms were still crossed and his eyes were still on the middle distance, and he had the look of a man reviewing the decisions of the past 6 months with the particular analytical focus that comes from understanding, too late, which of those decisions had been the pivotal ones. He had tried to move the contracts. The contracts were still there. He had tried to find grounds to challenge the creditor. The grounds had not existed. He had known, from the moment he'd started looking at the holding company's structure, that there was someone specific on the other side of this transaction. He just hadn't known who until 30 seconds ago. Vanessa looked at the 2 senior managers. Brian, who ran the technical division, and who had been with the company since Anthony's last expansion in 2009, was looking at her with the focused attention of a man trying to determine what the next week of his professional life looked like. Teresa, who managed client services, and who had called Vanessa twice in the months after she'd left, calls she had not been able to return for reasons that were obvious in retrospect, was looking at her with something simpler. Just recognition. The particular recognition of seeing someone you trusted come back. She told them directly. She said that nothing about the company's operations would change that morning. She said the team should proceed with normal work schedules and that no personnel decisions beyond those being announced today would be made without appropriate notice and proper process. She said her first priority was stabilizing the company's operational performance, not disrupting it, and that the employees of Wilson Mountain Equipment had done the work they were paid to do under circumstances that had not been of their making, and she intended to make that distinction clear to everyone in the building before the week was out. Then she told Brian and Teresa and the bank's representative that they were free to leave. They left. "Would you treat them with kindness?" The bank's representative shook Victor's hand on the way out with the quiet efficiency of a man who has executed his portion of a transaction and is satisfied that it closed correctly. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Teresa looked at Vanessa on her way to the door with an expression that stopped just short of saying something and then said it anyway without words, and Vanessa held the look long enough to let it land. The room contracted to the people who remained. Victor presented the formal consequences in the order they were documented in the restructuring agreement. Donald's removal from the CEO position was effective immediately, pursuant to the authority granted to the majority shareholder under the terms of the agreement he had signed the previous day, at which point in the proceedings he had not yet understood who the majority shareholder was. Lorraine was suspended from her position as Chief Financial Officer, pending a comprehensive legal and forensic audit of the company's financial records for the preceding 5 years, to be conducted by an independent firm engaged by the new ownership. Harold was barred from accessing the company's financial systems, vendor accounts, supplier contracts, and logistics management platforms until the same audit was complete and its findings had been assessed and acted upon. Patricia retained her board seat, which carried voting rights insufficient to influence any strategic decision without Vanessa's consent, and which was, in practical terms, exactly as consequential as her role had been formally designated to be, which was to say largely ceremonial. Donald said, "Dad built this. You have no right." And Vanessa said, "Your father built something worth saving. I'm going to save it. That's the last thing we have in common right now." That landed differently than the previous exchange. She could see it in the way the room held it. Not just Donald, but all of them, because the sentence did something that accusation and counter-accusation hadn't done. It reframed the argument around something none of them could reasonably dispute. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was what Anthony Wilson had actually built and what had happened to it under their stewardship, and that reframing was not comfortable for anyone in the room. Donald left. He gathered nothing from the table and said nothing else, and walked out of the conference room with the bearing of someone managing a controlled exit that he was unwilling to compromise by letting the door close loudly. Harold followed without making eye contact with anyone, his arms still crossed, his face still doing the deliberate blankness that was the clearest possible indication that he was feeling something he had no intention of showing. Lorraine rose, straightened the jacket she'd been wearing, with the same precision she applied to everything she wore, and walked out without looking at Vanessa. The room held Patricia and Victor and Vanessa. Victor collected his documentation, organized it, in the specific order he used when he wanted to be findable quickly, and looked at Vanessa. She didn't say anything. He picked up his case and told her he'd be in the conference room down the hall, and left. Would you treat them with kindness? Patricia, with hands folded in front of her on the table, her eyes on the surface rather than on her daughter, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence between them had a texture that was different from any silence they had shared in the 42 years they'd been in each other's lives. Not hostile, not cold, something more like the silence that exists at the edge of something large, where both people present know that what gets said next is going to be permanent. Patricia spoke first. Her voice was the voice Vanessa had grown up with, measured and settled, the voice of a woman who had almost never been uncertain about what she believed was right. And what it carried now was not uncertainty exactly, but something adjacent to it, a quality she didn't have a word for that she had never heard in her mother's voice before. Patricia said, "I didn't plan what happened on that mountain." She said it carefully, precisely, not saying it hadn't happened, not saying the outcome had been accidental, saying she had not planned it, which was a distinction that held, if you were being honest about it, a different kind of weight than either of the alternatives, because planning required intent at the beginning, and what to treat them with kindness. And what Patricia was describing, in the only terms she seemed able to find for it, was something that had assembled itself from smaller decisions, each of which had seemed, at the moment she made it, like the kind of decision a person could live with. Would you treat them with kindness? The decision to let Donald handle Vanessa's objections to the loan rather than address them herself. The decision to come on the hike when she must have understood at some level what Donald intended by bringing the documents. And the decision, standing on that trail with her daughter injured on the ground and the weather coming in from the northwest, to say what she had said and to walk away. She had not planned it. She had permitted it. And permission, Vanessa had thought about this in the long months of building Iron Leaf. Permission required a moment of conscious awareness that pure planning actually didn't. You had to know what you were allowing in order to allow it. That was not a smaller thing than planning. In some ways it was larger. Vanessa said, "Dad built a company. You sacrificed your daughter to protect the people who were destroying it. Would you treat them with kindness?" She said without the anger she would have brought to it in the first year after the mountain. The anger had been real, and it had been hers. And it had done its work, and then it had receded, not gone but transformed into something that had more utility than anger did, which was accurate understanding. She would treat them what her mother, Nonna, had done, and why she had done it, and the fact that she understood it did not make it forgivable in the conventional sense. It just made it clear. And clarity, she had found, was more durable than forgiveness, because it didn't require the same ongoing maintenance. Patricia looked at her, directly, for the first time since Vanessa had walked into the building. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, something that arrived in the space between them as though it had been waiting for this specific conversation to become possible. Would you treat them with kindness? And what it looked like was the expression of a person who has reached the end of a version of themselves, and is standing at the beginning of whatever comes next without knowing yet what that is. Patricia said, "I was trying to hold on to what your father built." Vanessa said, "You were trying to hold on to what Dad's name was attached to. That's different from what he built. What he built was about how you treat people. You didn't protect that. You traded it." The silence that followed was not accusation. It was simply what the room held after something true was said. Patricia asked her not to pursue the family further. The legal path, the forensic audit, the files Victor was already preparing to share with the appropriate regulatory and law enforcement authorities. She asked, in the way Patricia Johnson asked for things she considered necessary, directly, without softening, because Patricia had always believed that the clearest version of a request was the most respectful one. Vanessa said, "What the audit finds goes where it needs to go. That's not something I'm willing to reverse for you now. You asked me to do something like that 3 years ago. I said no then. I'm saying no now." Patricia absorbed this. She did not argue it, which was, in itself, something Vanessa noted. Vanessa reached into the bag she'd set on the chair beside her and took out the wooden box, small and plain, the kind of box that had been chosen for function rather than appearance. She set it on the table and opened it. The compass lay in its fitted interior the way it always had, the brass casing catching the conference room light with the soft luster of something well-maintained. The needle settled without drama at magnetic north. Her father had carried this for 31 years. She had carried it for 3. It was the one object she had managed to preserve through everything that had followed the trail. Would you treat them with kindness? Through the forestry station and the ambulance, and the hospital and football of Portland traffic, and 12 months of building Iron Leaf on the income of a consulting firm with one client, through all of it, the compass had been in the inner left pocket of whatever jacket she was wearing, not as a talisman or a ritual, but as a reminder of a very specific thing her father had taught her. She said, "He told me when you're lost, the compass doesn't care about your situation. It only shows you true north. And from north, you can work out everything else." Patricia looked at the compass in the box on the table between them. Vanessa said, "When you're lost, you don't keep following the people who led you the wrong way. You find your own direction." She closed the box. She left it on the table. Would you treat them with kindness? She stood and picked up her bag and walked out of the conference room, and didn't look back, not because she was performing a conclusion, but because there was nothing left in that room that required her presence. Would you treat them with kindness? And she had learned in 3 years of building things from nothing that the most expensive thing you can do with your time is spend it in spaces that have already given you everything they have. The hallway felt different on the way back toward the lobby. Not lighter exactly, more accurate. The weight was the same, but the weight was real now, properly attributed, no longer carried as the residue of something uncertain. Would you with kindness? She found Victor in the smaller conference room at the west end of the building, sitting at a table with his case open, and 3 separate documents organized in front of him with the arrangement of someone who was already working on the next thing. He looked up when she came in and she said, "It's done." He said, "All right," and closed the first document and opened a different one. Would you treat them with kindness? The conversation with the employees happened 2 days later, because she wanted to give the building time to settle before she stood in front of it. 120 people in the main assembly area gathered from both shifts, because she'd asked both shifts to come if they could, which they had, almost entirely, which was itself a piece of information. She had seen the way the workforce of a company that's been managed badly develops a particular wariness, a learned distrust of announcements and meetings and all-hands gatherings, because those things in a badly managed company tend to precede bad news. The fact that 120 people had shown up anyway told her something about what they were still capable of. She did not speak from prepared remarks. She said, "I want to tell you what I found when I looked at this company's books. Would you treat them with kindness? The financial problems you've been working around for the past 2 years didn't come from your work. They came from decisions made above you by people who are no longer in positions to make decisions. You came in and did your jobs under conditions that were not your fault, and I want you to hear that from me directly before I say anything else." She said treat them with kindness. Some other things after that, about the audit and what it would involve, about the personnel changes that had already taken effect, and what the operational plan for stabilization looked like. Would you treat them? About the supplier relationships she intended to rebuild, and the client conversations she was going to have personally over the next 6 weeks. She said all of it clearly and without hedging, because these were people who had been managed with insufficient honesty for long enough that directness was the only register that was going to register as genuine. When she stopped speaking, the room was quiet for a moment. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable, that is simply the sound of people processing something they haven't heard in a while. And then a man named Brian Thompson, who had run the technical floor since Anthony's second expansion, and whose name had been on the company's most reliable service records for 13 consecutive years, started clapping, not enthusiastically, steadily. The clap of someone who recognizes something real and wants to acknowledge it without overselling it. And it moved through the room, in the way things move through a room when they're genuine, not a wave exactly, more like a temperature change, room by room, and Vanessa stood at the front of the assembly area and received it without performing anything in return, because what they were offering didn't require performance. It required presence. She was present. Darnell flew in from Portland on Thursday to help manage Iron Leaf's West Coast operation remotely while Vanessa stayed in Piedmont through the transition. He set up at a desk in the office she'd reclaimed on the second floor of the building, the one that had been hers before she left. Would you treat them with kindness? Which Donald had converted to storage during the intervening years, and which had been cleared and returned to something functional by the time she arrived. Darnell had the quality she'd relied on since the beginning, which was that he adapted to the operational reality in front of him without requiring it to be different from what it was. And having him managing Portland while she managed Piedmont meant that neither half of the company she was now responsible for was operating on partial attention. The audit took 11 weeks. The firm you treat them with kindness. The firm Victor engaged was thorough and methodical, and produced a document that confirmed the structure she had mapped from memory in that hotel room at the edge of Tennessee, extended and detailed it with the precision of professional forensic accounting, and was sufficiently complete to give the relevant legal and regulatory authorities everything they needed to proceed. She submitted the documentation to the appropriate parties and stepped back from that process entirely. It was no longer hers to manage. She had built the mechanism that made it possible and handed it to people whose job it was to operate it. That was sufficient. Donald's removal from the CEO role exposed him to personal liability that his attorney was still working through 8 months after the ownership transition. Lorraine reached a civil settlement with terms she was not party to. Harold's vendor contracts were terminated the same week the audit was delivered, and the investigation into his arrangements proceeded through channels she tracked only long enough to confirm they were moving and then stopped following. Could you treat them with kindness? Prisha retained the board position that meant nothing, and Vanessa saw her twice in professional contexts in the year that followed, briefly in rooms that also contained other people, and both times they conducted themselves with the specific formality of people who share a history too large to summarize, and have agreed without discussing it, not to try. The company's first profitable quarter under new ownership came 14 months after the transition closed. Not dramatically, not in a way that generated industry coverage or required a press release. In the way that real financial recovery tends to arrive when the structural problems have been addressed, and the actual work has been allowed to produce its natural result, quietly, visible in the numbers and in the weekly operational reports, and in the fact that 2 of the enterprise clients she'd personally negotiated years earlier who had left under Donald, came back. One of them sent a note. She kept it. She and Victor had the naming conversation in the 9th month. Would you treat them with kindness? They sat in the conference room at the end of the main hallway, the same conference room where everything had concluded, and they talked through what the company should be called going forward. She was clear about one thing from the beginning of that conversation. The name Wilson was not going on the new building. Not because she wanted to erase her father's legacy, but because she understood, specifically and carefully, that her father's legacy was not his name on a building. His legacy was in the 30 years of phone calls answered at 10 o'clock at night and drives made to shake a hand before signing anything, and supplier relationships maintained with the consistency of someone who understood that trust is structural, not decorative. That legacy was already in the culture she was rebuilding. It didn't need the name. They called it Iron Leaf Mountain Industries. The mountain for the geographies, and for what the word actually meant to her now, not as metaphor but as the specific location of the worst and most clarifying thing that had ever happened to her. The Iron Leaf for what she'd built in Portland that had made the rest possible. She had the sign changed on a Tuesday morning in January, and stood in the parking lot and looked at it for a moment, and then went back inside to work, which was the correct response. She went back to the Blue Ridge in October of the following year. Alone, on a day she'd chosen specifically, because the forecast was clear, and the temperature was reasonable, and there was no reason to use any of those conditions as an excuse not to go. Would you treat them with kindness? She drove up in the morning and took the trail to Crestline Pass the way she'd taken it a dozen times before the last time, with the specific awareness of someone walking a familiar route that has been altered by what happened on it. The weather was what mountain autumn weather is in North Carolina when it cooperates, which is still and cold and luminous in a way that has no equivalent at lower elevation. Would you treat them with kindness? The view from the overlook was what the view had always been, the spread of highland terrain extending in every direction, with the particular silence that Anthony Wilson had loved, the silence where the wind moved through the upper trees, and you could hear that nothing in the landscape had been made by human hands. She had stood here with him a dozen times. She stood here now without him. She stood at the point on the trail where she had fallen. She didn't mark it with anything or perform any gesture toward it. She just stood there long enough to feel what the place actually was now versus what it had been before, and what she found was that it was simply a point on a trail, a section of icy rock that she had navigated badly on a day when other things were happening. The would you treat them with kindness? The meaning she'd been carrying around of the place for 3 years, the weight and the charge of it had transferred. It lived in what she'd built from it, not in the geographies itself. Would you treat them with kindness? She stood at the overlook for longer, the place where Anthony's ashes had gone into the mountain air 2 years before the last time she'd been here. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about what he would have made of the preceding 3 years, not as a question she was going to answer, because she'd learned to be suspicious of the answers people construct to questions about what dead people would have thought. The way those answers always manage to conveniently align with what the person doing the constructing needs to believe. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about it as a question she could hold without answering, which was different. What she believed carefully was that her father had valued 2 things above everything else in the running of his business. He had valued doing work that was actually good, and he had valued treating the people involved in that work with the consistency that comes from believing their dignity is not negotiable. She had tried to build both of those things into Iron Leaf Mountain Industries. Would you treat them with kindness? She could not have done it if she'd gone back to Wilson Mountain Equipment on the terms that had been available to her. She could only do it on the terms she had created. She took the compass from her jacket pocket and held it in her palm for a moment, without looking at it, just feeling the weight of it, the worn brass casing, that was exactly the same temperature as the air around her because she'd been walking long enough for it to equilibrate. Then she looked at the needle. True north. The same direction it had always been pointing and would always point, indifferent to her history or her achievement or her loss or the quality of this particular October morning, simply oriented, simply accurate, the way the best instruments always are. Would you treat them? She had thought in the forest station on the second night there that she didn't want to go back and reclaim her position, that she wanted something different, something that required the patience and precision that the people who had left her there were not capable of. She had not known then exactly what that would look like. She had just known it was possible. That was enough. That had been, it turned out, exactly enough. She put the compass back in her pocket. She stood at the overlook for a little while longer, not because she needed to, but because the view was worth the time, and because there was something right about not rushing this particular moment, not treating it as a stop on the way to the next thing, but as the thing itself, which it was. Her father had known that about these mountains, that the view required you to be present to it rather than on the way through it. She had been on the way through too many things for too long. She was present now. Then she turned away from the overlook and started down the trail. The path was clear in the late morning light, the surface dry, her ankle strong enough after 2 years of recovery to handle the descent without the compensating gait she'd carried for the first year. She walked at a normal pace. She knew exactly where the path went and how long it took and what was at the bottom of it. There were people who had stood at the top of this mountain 3 years ago and calculated that she would not make it down. Would you treat them with kindness? They had based that calculation on everything they thought they knew about who she was, a version of her that had been assembled from how useful she'd been to them and how completely she had accepted their framing of what she was worth and what she was capable of. They had looked at that assembled version and decided it could be eliminated by elevation and cold and the removal of a phone and a set of keys. And they had been so confident in that calculation that they had not thought to ask the more important question, which was what she would build if she survived. She had survived. She had built it, and the thing she had built was not a response to them. Exactly. It was not the conversion of their specific harm into a specific countermove. It was what she would have built anyway if she had found a way to leave on her own terms 3 years earlier. Would you treat them with kindness? It was just the version of the building that came after the mountain, which meant it was built with the knowledge of what she was capable of in the worst possible conditions. The knowledge that could not have come any other way, that required exactly that kind of extremity to become undeniable. Not to anyone else but to her. They had wanted her gone. She had gone and built something, and come back and bought the thing they were protecting. And the thing that she carried from all of it, the thing that had survived the mountain and the forest station and the hospital and 4 days in a hotel room at the edge of Tennessee and 2 years in Portland and everything that followed, was not the anger and not the strategic intelligence and not even the equity position she now held in a company that bore her father's original geographic claim to this land. It was the knowledge, simple and durable, and not requiring any maintenance at all, of exactly whose lot she was, when there was nothing left to be but herself. The trail was clear. She knew where she was going. She walked down the mountain.